Mike.
I'm an addict. My name is Mike. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I celebrate recovery from crack cocaine, marijuana, anger, not being good enough, and insecurity. My first memory was one of domestic violence. It was of my parents screaming at one another while my father packed his belongings. My older sister and I sat on my mother's lap, crying as my father exited our lives. My biological father eventually passed away at the age of 49, with having little to no influence or contact in my life. Most of what I knew about him came from the hateful things my mother would say about him. We struggled for a few years until my mother met the man I now call my father, and we married. A new home, new family, new school meant new struggles. I was diagnosed with ADD and was placed in a special education class in 1977, during which time I was also placed on the drug Ritalin. Overwhelmed with insecurity, I struggled to find a place where I belonged. I was terrible at sports, good friends were hard to come by, and I really didn't know what to make of anything. I called through the next 4 years in a fog, trying unsuccessfully to avoid being the playground punching bag. During those years, my mother had placed me in a martial arts class to handle the social and personal stigma that comes with being an insecure special education student in the 70s. This would prove pinnacle later in my life. My mother also worked tirelessly to research my apparent illness, only to discover that hypoglycemia was the cause of my lack of attention and retention. She quickly changed all the food in the house to fit the needs of her son's diet. Then by the 7th grade, I tested back into the mainstream classes. I'll never forget hearing the news and jumping into my mother's arms. She was my best friend throughout those years. During those years, I spent a stint in CCD class. And while the belief that God existed was a general given in our home, our family was never really anything more than calendar Christians, attending church on holidays and special occasions. Throughout high school, I remained an underachiever, insecure, and unsure of myself. Like most kids my age, I would sneak out, drink, and smoke weed. At the age of 15, I found myself drinking on the weekends and smoking weed on a daily basis. I continually looked for a savior in the form of the perfect female who would validate my greatness simply by her acceptance of me. Someone that could reassure me that I had a purpose. Codependency for me was a way of life. After several broken hearts, bad decisions, and barstool romances, I met the woman who would ultimately become my wife and the mother of my daughter. During those years, I had turned the tides of my sense of self and became an overachiever in everything I did. I took my working out to another level. I went to college for criminal justice, and I continued martial arts, earning black belts in various arts. I also became very well read in the topics of religion, philosophy, spiritual, and human performance. I worked as a manager in Nabisco and taught martial arts at several locations on the side, as well as attended high-level bodyguard school. I was considered by most an honorable man. However, after 9 years of being together and 3 years of marriage, this relationship, like the rest, would fail. How could this happen, I asked. I did everything right. How could God let this happen? To make the country music song complete, I also lost my seemingly wonderful job. I saw this time as the right opportunity to start my own martial arts school and do what I had always dreamed of. But with no idea how to run a business, this too would become yet another failure. That was it, I proclaimed. Screw it became my mantra. I was angry. Everything I touched, it failed. I was angry at my father for leaving. Was I that miserable and worthless that he could just turn and leave? I was angry at my mother for her resentments over my divorce. I was angry at my stepdad for being emotionally unavailable. And yes, I was angry at God. This was no pity party, mind you. This was a culmination of expectations and failures. I now knew that my darkest fear could be real, that I was a mistake. I began using drugs seriously to soothe the realities of my failure. You see, the determination of my mother and father's dedication to their family laid a secret that wasn't so secret. For years, I watched my mother and stepdad, the man I call my father, use drugs constantly. Their joints and bongs and other paraphernalia could always be seen around the house, open on the tables around. I found cocaine mirrors and straws as well. I had also witnessed them use acid and other drugs. My house was known around town as a party place. As a young teenager and young adult, my parents and I would often get high together and drink together. My mother's motto was, I would rather have you do it in the house than on the streets. There was always a party at my house. At that time, it was cool always having a keg on tap or some type of gathering where my friends and I could see older women and feel cool hanging out with older guys in the party scene. Pornography was always a room away, and adult sexual topics were never filtered. During this time, there was more than a few occasions where females and males had made sexual advances towards me as a young teenager. My first round of cocaine was at my home from a family friend. As a teenager, many of my weekends were spent away, so my parents could party alone. At that time, I thought I was living a teenager dream. My parents still went to work. My mother even graduated with a master's degree. They provided food on the table, took us on vacations, loved us very much. And they seemed to be able to use functionally, at least to the naked eye. I would not be so fortunate, however. After my divorce, my marijuana use became an everyday, all-day affair. After about 3 more years of searching and crawling through various failures, I started using cocaine. Although I used it as a young teenager, young adult, it now had a different effect. This time, cocaine made me feel as though I was good enough, if not better. I was using at least 3 times a week. During that time, I had been employed with my brother-in-law and my sister at their business. Seeing my late arrivals and sleeping at work, they had me drug tested. I, of course, failed. With another job loss and the news of my drug use quickly spreading to the rest of my family, the downward spiral quickly escalated. The only reprieve of my using came when I had the weekend visits with my daughter. That, however, would also become another victim of my addiction. My parents and my daughter's mother went into court having an emergency supervised visitation only order placed between me and my daughter, who is now 5 years of age. I was angry beyond all belief. How could they do this to me, I thought. After all, my parents not only used drugs in front of me, but with me. This was not fair. Shortly thereafter, I was told by my parents that they would refuse to arrange meeting times between me and my daughter or uphold the court-issued order because it was too much drama, as I had broken down and cried out of guilt in front of my daughter during the visit. The knot at the end of my rope had been cut, and a free fall ensued. Instead of getting it together, I was fueled by the failure as a business owner, as a father, and not being able to sustain any healthy relationship whatsoever. Anger and depression became my coping tools. I went from 0 to 60 in record time. After losing my apartment because I couldn't pay rent, I bounced around from place to place, staying only long enough to use up the respect and trust from everyone that was trying to help me. Then I went to living on the streets. Using crack cocaine became an everyday affair. My only moments of sobriety came from the daily phone conversations I would have with my daughter and brief visits during birthdays and holidays. The money I would make came from working security and bouncing jobs wherever and however I could. I found myself in some of the worst watering holes this side of Mexico. My talent for fighting, coupled with addiction and desperation, made me an attractive candidate for some unsavory employment positions. I collected money and made house calls for biker gangs, mobsters, and bookies. I would have prostitutes pick up Johns and pull them out of their car and take their money. If they didn't give it willingly, then it got ugly. Drug dealers always had a guy they said they could fight, so at least twice a month I found myself in arranged street fights. And if I couldn't come up with the money to get drugs, then it was time to rob the dealers. Many of these fights were not pretty. Some of them I lost, and a couple of times, death was only a second away. My addiction was at a savage level. This continued for about 3 years straight. The last 6 months were absolutely brutal. I slept in abandoned cars wherever I could find them. I ate out of dumpsters and waited in the back of restaurants in hopes of getting food from a waiter that would show me pity. More and more I found myself on the steps of the neighborhood churches in the middle of the night, weeping endlessly, begging God to take this addiction from me. If you were to see me, pity is all that you would feel. Suicide was a constant option, and I felt death's sting in every moment. After my 12th arrest, I stepped in front of a judge who instructed me to go to drug school. Knowing my addiction was way too much to be left to my own mischievous ways, I opted to put myself in an inpatient rehab. And after 30 days of sobriety, counseling, and a full stomach, I was ready to re-enter the world. But with no plan, no money, no job, and nowhere to stay, I quickly found myself back where I was. But this time was a little different. A counselor in rehab had taught me about guilt and shame. He taught me that being a liar, a thief, a drug user wasn't who I was. These were just things I had done. And even though I knew he wasn't supposed to, he talked to me about Jesus as the higher power. And he briefly talked about forgiveness and told me how Jesus saw me. His words were very impactful. Yet still, the physical addiction had laid its hands on me once again. The difference was, I would no longer fight, steal, or hurt anyone to get high. If I couldn't get high, so be it. And as a newsflash, it appears that if you don't show up for court, they don't forget about it.
Oh my goodness.
So, after about 5 months of being out there again, I was arrested on outstanding warrants. More jail time for me, but this time was different. I learned that in jail, keeping with the religious groups kept me from being recruited into gangs and less of a target. I began praying and pulling back the faith I thought long since gone. I kept to myself and just did time and eventually got out. If I only knew one thing, is that I didn't want to use again. I asked my mother and my father if I could come stay with them. Reluctantly, they said yes. After a couple of weeks of me telling stories of where I was overnight versus where I should be, they kicked me out in the dead of winter. Although this was entirely my own doing, I lashed out at them in anger, once again, because my anger at my family was really at my anger at my own inability to beat my own addiction. My aunt and uncle, who lived in a small town in a small neighborhood, agreed to let me stay with them. They already had a house full and little money coming in, yet still took me in. Had it not been for their grace and compassion, I would have surely died out there. We all agreed to put me on lockdown. I would clean and earn my keep the best I could. I ran and exercised daily. While they never said anything and always supported me, I could feel my welcome wearing thin after about 3 months. Then I received a phone call from an old friend who had heard my story. He had an opportunity I couldn't pass up. He told me that if I helped work in his business, he would let me live in Chicago rent-free. I had been sober for almost 5 months. I'm now living downtown, and a friend had hooked me up with a security job in an upscale nightclub city. Weed smoking came back to me as a casual coping device to deal with the fact that while sober from crack cocaine, my daughter was nowhere closer to being in my life. I attended AA, NA, and CA meetings here and there, but nothing serious. Within a very short time, I was hired to be the head of security in several different locations by high-level security contractors. I had started my martial arts business back up. I got back on the seminar circuit, and I was moving in the right direction. After a year and a half of helping my friend, I had managed to save up enough money to get a place of my own. I finally felt like I was taking the moral high ground. Like every place I lived before, I bought a bed and acquired furniture for a second bedroom for my daughter. Every day I would sit in that room, oftentimes crying. You see, the only plan of action I had at that time was hope, peppered with a few desperate prayers. She never stepped foot in any of those rooms. Heading up security in the nicest champagne lounge in Chicago is where I thought I belonged. 2 years ago, I was eating out of dumpsters, and now I was toasting drink to Jim Belushi and hanging out with Edward Norton and superstar athletes. I got to bodyguard some of the most renowned actors and actresses of our time, and I was good at it. However, even working construction during the day, security at night, and teaching martial arts, I was barely able to get by. My child support payments were barely, if any. The allure of the nightlife was overwhelming, and so were the side effects. You see, I could deal with the guarding the celebrities while they did cocaine and had their sexual rants. I could even deal with the Colombian dealer putting huge bags of cocaine in my hand for free as kind of a turn-your-head thing. The third time he did it, however, was much different. I finished the bag, finished my shift, and hopped on a train at 4 in the morning to the Greens. Spent 2 days in the row houses smoking crack. Here I am again. A continued sober life seemed like a fantasy. I remember thinking that this is how I would be remembered, found dead with a crack pipe in my hand. After 2 days of using and another 3 days of weeping, and yet again, I vowed to get it together. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to get it together again. During these times, I would take 3 trains, a bus, and a cab every time there was a party or get-together that my daughter may be at. My family continued to speak ill of me while treating me with a polite disdain. I stayed sober for another 3 months before meeting a lady online who apparently had been through some of the same addiction struggles as me. She had a good job, a house, 2 teenage kids, and we were both survivors. We left to move to Elmhurst. We decided to celebrate our not using by using. Because that's smart, right? That's what we do. So that celebrating went from every 6 months to every 3 months, to every 2 months, to every month, to every week. Not only had I not gotten my custody of my daughter back, but my girlfriend and I were now ditching our kids and sending them off so we could use. I was now doing the very same thing I had blamed my parents for doing. I left her the security jobs, came back to the very neighborhood where I started. Put all my chips into faith. You see, I never stopped believing in God. I just didn't think he believed in me. I had no car, no job, a cheap apartment above a bar, but I had to be closer to my daughter. I immediately started teaching again. I started praying more and more, and I remember the Lord speaking to my heart. And when you haven't heard it in a while, you kind of recognize it when you do hear it. He directed me to teach people, not just martial arts, but to help people save themselves from the real-life violence I had put myself in and was a part of. But regardless of the superstar clients I may have had showing up when needed, none of it seemed to matter to my family. When all that mattered to me was their acceptance of me. Because I was raised to believe that family is all that you need, and it's all that we had had. But now I was shunned, because my lies and my behavior had taken its toll in all of my relationships. My relapses became further and further apart. I went to meetings, but was no more of a visitor than a member. During all of this time, my family came to see me once in 8 years, and now that I lived only minutes away, that would not change. I was still very much alone, still trying to find my place. I began to hear God's voice in my heart more and more. During times of guilt and struggle, I would recall what my rehab counselor would say about how Jesus thought of me. My parents bought a new home and offered me to come back and live in the house that I grew up in, perhaps fix it up. This was my chance to show everyone that I had finally made it and got my stuff together. Because I figured if everybody thought I had my stuff together, I would magically be cured. For months, all we did was argue. The tenor of almost all of our conversations between me and my family was full of anger and words that I know none of us meant. It was almost a contest of who could hurt who the most. You see, even though my sobriety from crack cocaine was going well, I was not emotionally, mentally, or spiritually sober. I downsized my addictions. I started using women. It wasn't about sex always. It was just about not being alone. I was still the scared little kid in special ed. Then one day while arguing with my mother, I became bold, yelling, "You need to admit some of your mistakes that you have made." Because again, you see, I think if everybody admits what they've done, I'll magically be cured. She replied with, "My mistake was you." While I know she surely didn't mean this, at the time it dropped me to my knees. And this is all my addiction needed. It was waiting for that opportunity. I went out and got the drugs. I got the pipe, and I sat and began to use. I was trying to get high while bawling out my eyes. Well, what I feared was confirmed. It was confirmed through my constant failures, my endless addictions. And now the final nail had been driven in. There was no type of high, however, that could rescue me from this feeling. And I became so angry at the drugs that I was using that I blew up screaming at the top of my lungs. Everything my addiction had taken from me had came back to this point. I stood up, I went outside, I threw the bag of crack cocaine as far as I could. I broke the glass pipe with my hands, cutting myself, then stomped the broken pieces on the ground. I hit the ground and I didn't just cry out for him, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "God, please save me."
Amen. Amen.
I laid there weeping uncontrollably. Then after what seemed like forever, I heard it again. So I stopped. I sat up, calmed my breathing, and I heard it again. "It's okay, Michael. I love you." I looked around to see if perhaps someone else was there. There was no one else there, and yet I heard it again, and I heard it again, and I heard it again. So for about 3 days, I was in this daze. You see, up until that moment, I had relived the first and second steps over and over and over again. But it wasn't until that moment that I did my third step to its fullest. I turned the care of my life over to the will of God. That was the last time I ever saw crack cocaine.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
It was the last time I ever felt alone.
Amen.
For years, I believed that I was not good enough for God, and that God, like everyone else, would only accept me if I could fix myself what was good enough. I realized at that moment I had been fighting a fight for most of my life that had already been won. 2 Corinthians 8:12 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me." Knowing the depths of my sickness and struggles, God began to put an all-star team together to walk with me during the times that I could not hear his voice. Almost immediately, I met an amazing woman who would soon become my best friend. She would be there when I was confronted with old habits, thoughts, and hang-ups. She would answer my calls at 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. She always provided me with the 2 things I needed most: truth and love. After a few months, I asked her if she was going to invite me to church. That's when I walked into faith. Literally. I went directly to the front to sit because I'm in it to win it now. A man named Demetrius walked up to me and gave me a hug and invited me to Men of Faith, and I jumped right in. I saw a sermon given by Pastor Jeff Klein and his brother who was special needs. God hit me with his heart and said, "Do this." Okay. I signed up to be a part of this Reflectors ministry and here at Faith, the special needs ministry. At the required first class, I walked right up to Vinny Adams, who runs the Reflectors ministry, and I said, "I'm not sure what I'm doing here. The Lord put this on my heart, and here I am. But there's this thing. I've got some felonies. I've got 15 arrests. I'm no good. And I've got a history I'm not proud of, and a criminal record." And if he could see right through me, piercing, looked right at my heart, and he gave me the most comforting smile, and he said, "It's okay. We'd love to have you."
Amen.
Then God put Charlie Bartucci smack dab in the seat in front of me at church, and you know how that worked out. Here I am, right? You see, God allowed me to see his love for me through the amazing people that he was putting in my life. I had so much repair work to do from my past. My license was suspended. I hadn't paid much in the way of child support. I still didn't have my daughter back. I had several outstanding warrants, and my business was struggling. Many of my old thinking patterns also remained. But since that day, I stopped praying for the calm seas and prayed for the strength to endure the raging storms, and Jesus Christ made that possible.
Amen.
With the conviction and compassion of my Lord and the incredible team God had assembled, I took care of all those warrants and suspended license. My business continues to increase in value every day. We now have 8 locations throughout the country, all run by grateful Christians.
Woo!
I am very proud to say that my daughter now sleeps in our home in her own bed without restrictions. There we go. I now serve every weekend in the special needs ministry and work as a behavioral liaison between the volunteers and participants. And that best friend, that rock who God put in my life and continually guided me through it all, well, I married that amazing woman this past month. My relationship with my family, well, many of them are sitting here right now. God's working miracles every day, things I could never do. And although the scars remain, they serve as a reminder of how far God has brought me. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, a new creation has come. The old is gone, the new one is here.
Amen.
To the newcomer I say, what do you have to lose? If you are living in pain, feeling that you are a mistake and you don't belong, look around you. You are not here by mistake. Up to this point, you have thrown your life away to the world, and it hurts. I challenge you to stop throwing your life away to the world and give it away to God.
Wow.
He built his ministry on people just like us. You know, they say that Jesus was a carpenter. Well, that man rebuilt my life. And well, that carpenter, he left us a toolbox. Okay? And when you open up that toolbox, newcomer, you will find that Jesus used people just like you to change the world. Friends, I hope that through my story you have come to see what I have. That no matter what I did, no matter where I was, where I went, didn't matter. I couldn't do it. Only God could do it.
Amen.
Only God could save me. Being shot at wasn't enough. Having my daughter taken away wasn't enough. Being stabbed wasn't enough. Begging for food wasn't enough. Having people die in my arms from heroin overdose wasn't enough. But Jesus Christ, he was enough. He is enough. I shouldn't be alive. By all accounts, I should be dead. Many of you know what I'm saying. Been through that. But he saved my life. So I made a decision that when I die, it will not be with a knife at my wrist, a barrel of a gun in my mouth, or a crack pipe in my hand. When I am taken home, it will be standing tall as a warrior of God.
Amen.
Amen.
Thanks to God, sobriety is a reality and not just a fantasy. You see, it was God who turned my mess into a message. He turned my fear into faith. Through my pain, he gave me purpose. And in my falling, he delivered me a calling. So now I say, death, where is your sting? I am a child of the one true King. And I am not a mistake. Thank you.